We are going to graph trigonometric functions by hand, and when we do this, we're only going to graph one period of each function. So before we get into examples, let's look at the parent functions. If I want to graph y equals sine of x by hand, I need to graph one period. So remember, the amplitude for the parent function is 1, and the period is 2 pi. So the way we graph this is there are 5 points we need, okay, and sine starts at the x-axis, makes the mountain, and then the valley. The 5 points we need where it starts, we need the maximum, we need where it crosses back through the x-axis, we need the minimum, and then we need the final ending point that ends the valley. So these 5 coordinates, we have to label the x-axis for each of these 5 coordinates. So the total length is the period. So my last coordinate is going to be at 2 pi, and then it always starts at 0. Okay, so the way I do this is I find the period halfway from the starting point to the end of the period. So half of 2 pi is just 1 pi. Okay, half of that will give me this point here. So halfway between 0 and pi is 1/2 pi. And then halfway between 1 and 2 gives me 1.5 pi, or 3 pi over 2. Okay, so we've labeled our x-axis, and now we can sketch the coordinate, or we can sketch the function. So it makes the mountain and then the valley. And then the last thing we need to label is our amplitude. So it goes up to 1, and then the minimum is -1. So that's sine. Cosine is going to be very similar because the amplitude and the period are the same. So my x-axis, those 5 coordinates are going to be the same. So pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. So this is important to know. We always start with labeling our x-axis, and then we can sketch our 5 points. So cosine starts at the x-axis, and then it makes the smiley face. So my shape is like this. The amplitude is 1, which means the maximum is +1. Oops, the minimum is -1. So that's how we graph our parent functions. Now let's look at example number 4. We want to graph 3 cosine of 2x. So by looking at this, we have our amplitude, and we can find our period. So our amplitude here is 3, which means I can go ahead and label my top point up here as 3 and my bottom point as -3. Now we need to find what is our period. So we're going to do 2 pi over b, or that gives us 2 pi over 2, which means our period is just pi. So to label our x-axis, it's going to always start at 0. And then our period is pi. So our ending point is pi. We need to find the 3 other points. So like I said, the way I do this is I first find what is halfway between 0 and pi. And it might even be easy to think about this as 1 pi. So halfway between 0 and 1 is 1/2. But it's 1/2 pi because we're dealing with 0 and 1 pi. Okay, halfway between 0 and 1/2, well, that's 1/4, so that's 1/4 pi. And then halfway between 1/2 and 1 is 3/4, so 3/4 pi. So now we have our x-axis and our y-axis labeled. So remember, our function makes a smiley face, and this is positive. So it's going to cross through the 5 points I've sketched here. So let me go ahead, draw my graph, and that is our first example. Next one, we are graphing -2 sine of 4x. So -2, already I'm dealing with a reflection. So instead of making a mountain and then a valley, I'm first going to make my valley and then my mountain because it's reflected. Okay, so valley and then mountain. And our amplitude, it's +2. So remember, amplitude can never be negative. So up to and down to. And then our period, that we need to calculate. So to find our period, we are going to do 2 pi over b. Our b value is 4, so 2 pi over 4. We can simplify that to 1/2 pi. Okay, so we need to label our x-axis. We have the 0 and we have the 1/2 pi. We need to get the 3 other coordinates. So like I said, I like to find the middle coordinate first. So halfway between 0 and 1/2 is 1/4. So 1/4, and it has a pi because it's really halfway between 0 and 1/2 pi. And then now halfway between 0 and 1/4 is 1/8. And if you are struggling with how I'm getting these numbers, what I'm doing to find this number is I'm really taking 1/4 and I am dividing this by 2. So if you do 1/4 divided by 2, that gives you 1/8. Okay, so that's how I got 1/8 pi. And then to find this coordinate here, what's halfway between 1/4 and 1/2? So what you can do, if you're someone who struggles with fractions in our calculator, we can find the average of these two numbers, add them up, and divide by 2. When we do that, we find that halfway between 1/4 and 1/2 is 3/8. Don't forget your pi, it's really 3/8 pi. So now we've labeled our x-axis. We can now sketch our graph. So remember, this one's reflected, so it's going to go down to make the valley before it goes up to make the mountain. So it starts at the x-axis, and there's our function. Next one, we have sine of pi over x. So here the amplitude is 1, and the period we need to calculate. So the period is 2 pi over b, which gives me 2 pi over, here my b value is pi. So this simplifies nicely to just 2. So here's 1, here's -1, and then over here it's just 2. For this example, we're not dealing with any pi's. So I have 0 and 2. Halfway between 0 and 2 is 1. Halfway between 0 and 1 is 1/2. And then halfway between 1 and 2, you can either put 1.5 or 3/2. I'll take either one. So this is our regular sine function. It's going to make the mountain, and then it's going to make the valley. So here are my 5 coordinates, and then the sketch of my graph looks like that. Last example, I have negative cosine of 1/2 x. So my amplitude here, it's still going to be 1, because remember it's the absolute value, but we are dealing with a reflection. So it's going to start down here at -1 since it's reflected over the x-axis and it has that negative in front. Next we need to find the period. So the period gives me 2 pi over b. In this problem, my b value is 1/2. So 2 pi divided by 1/2, that's the same thing as multiplying by 2, which really just gives me 4 pi. So this one's nice to put on the x-axis. So it goes 0, and then 4 pi is where our period ends. Well, halfway between those two is 2 pi, and then halfway between 0 and 2 is 1 pi. Halfway between 2 and 4 is 3 pi. So now let's go ahead and sketch. So remember, this one starts down here at -1, and then it's going to make the frowny face since it is reflected. And sketch over a graph. Looks like that.